In a room dripping with diamonds and ambition, one man believed he was king. Henry Thomas surveyed the glittering Gala, a master of his universe, confident that every person in his life was a carefully chosen asset. His mistake, the fatal flaw in his empire of arrogance, was a blindness to the value he couldn't own. Tonight, when a mysterious woman in emerald green captured the attention of every power player in the city, he would dismiss her. He had no idea he was looking at the wife he had discarded, a woman rebuilt from the ashes of his neglect into a masterpiece of success, whose unveiling would be his undoing. The air in the grand ballroom of the Metropolitan Museum of Art was thick with the scent of money, a heady perfume of rare orchids and vintage champagne. It was the annual Benefactors Gala, a night where the city's old money titans and new tech gods collided in a dazzling display of wealth and influence. And at the center of his own universe, holding court near a towering ice sculpture of a swan, was Henry Thomas. To look at Henry was to look at a portrait of success. His tuxedo was bespoke Tom Ford, his watch a Patek Philippe Calatrava that cost more than most people's homes, and his smile was a weapon, calibrated for maximum charm and intimidation. He was a master of mergers and acquisitions, a corporate predator who had devoured his way to the top of the Wall Street food chain. Everything in his life was an asset, including the woman clinging to his arm, Tiffany Vance. Tiffany was 24, a decade younger than Henry, with hair the color of spun gold and eyes that reflected the sparkle of the diamonds around her neck. She was his upgrade, as he'd once drunkenly called her. His first wife, he reasoned, had been necessary, a quiet, mousy woman who had managed his home and supported his early career with a gentle, unassuming competence. But she wasn't an asset. She was wallpaper. Tiffany, with her social media influence and her father's political connections, was a statement piece. "Darling, isn't that Harrison Kane from Apex Industries?" Tiffany whispered, her voice a breathy purr. "He's been avoiding your calls." Henry's eyes narrowed slightly, following her gaze. "Not for long. Tonight, everyone takes my call." He exuded a confidence that bordered on divine right. This room, these people, they were his kingdom. He had built this life brick by gilded brick, and he had discarded anything and anyone who didn't fit the blueprint. He was in the middle of a story, loudly recounting a recent hostile takeover to a captive audience of lesser executives, when a subtle shift occurred in the room's energy. It started as a ripple, a few heads turning toward the grand archway entrance, then more, until a wave of silence washed over the boisterous chatter. Standing in the entryway was Damien Chevalier. Even in a room of billionaires, Chevalier was a different species. He was a myth, a reclusive tech genius who had revolutionized data security and then vanished from the public eye, his wealth multiplying in the shadows. He rarely attended such events, and his presence alone was enough to cause a stir. But it wasn't just Chevalier that had captured the room's attention. It was the woman on his arm. She was a vision in emerald green. The silk of her gown shimmered like liquid jade under the chandeliers, cut in a classic, elegant style that bespoke timeless grace rather than fleeting fashion. Her dark hair was swept up in a sophisticated chignon, revealing the graceful line of her neck in a pair of emerald and diamond earrings that danced with light. She wasn't just beautiful. She radiated a quiet, potent confidence that was more magnetic than any overt display of glamour. She moved with a poise that suggested she belonged not just in this room, but in any room she chose to enter. "Well, well," Tiffany sneered quietly, her grip tightening on Henry's arm. "Looks like the dragon has found a new princess to lock in his tower. I wonder how much he paid for her." Henry laughed, a short, dismissive sound. He appraised the woman with a practiced, critical eye. She was striking, he'd give her that. But there was a softness to her, an artistic sensitivity in the way she held herself that he found unimpressive. She lacked the sharp, hungry edges of women like Tiffany. She's beautiful, I suppose, if you like the library and the countryside type. Probably some artist he's decided to patronize. He'll be bored of her in a month. He watched as Damien Chevalier guided the woman through the crowd, parting the sea of gawkers with his mere presence. He leaned in and murmured something in her ear, and she smiled. It was a genuine, luminous smile that seemed to light her from within. For a fleeting, inexplicable second, a strange feeling pricked at Henry's memory. A phantom echo of something familiar. The curve of that smile, the light in her eyes. He shook it off instantly. It was impossible. The woman he was thinking of couldn't command a room like this. She wouldn't know how to wear a dress like that, how to stand next to a man like Chevalier and look like his equal. The woman he was thinking of was a ghost, a footnote in his biography. The woman he was thinking of was his ex-wife, Serafina. "Let's go, darling," he said to Tiffany, his focus shifting back to the hunt. "I need to have a word with Senator Thompson. Chevalier and his flavor of the month can wait." He turned his back on the woman in green, completely oblivious, and strode deeper into his kingdom, never noticing the faint, sad smile that touched her lips as she watched him walk away. She had seen him, and she had seen that in his eyes there wasn't even a flicker of recognition. She was, just as he had always promised, completely forgotten. Serafina Charlotte felt the weight of 100 pairs of eyes on her, but the only gaze that mattered was Damien's. He leaned closer, his voice a low, reassuring murmur against her ear. "Are you all right? We can leave whenever you wish. This was for you, not for them." She offered him that smile, the one that had momentarily snagged Henry's subconscious. "I'm fine, Damien. Better than fine." And she was. The fear that had churned in her stomach on the ride over had settled into a steely resolve. Seeing Henry, arrogant and oblivious as ever, had not broken her. It had solidified her purpose. This wasn't about revenge. Not really. Revenge was a hot, messy emotion, and what she felt now was a cool, clean certainty. This was about closing a door, about proving to the ghost that still whispered in her ear on sleepless nights that its voice had no more power. The ghost sounded a lot like Henry. "You're nothing without me, Sarah. Who are you? A failed art history major who got lucky and married me? You're forgettable. In a year, no one will even remember your name." Those had been his parting words, delivered with chilling indifference in the cold, minimalist apartment he had already chosen for himself. He had handed her the divorce papers as if he were handing off a dry cleaning ticket. The marriage, their 10 years together, had been a transaction he was now closing out. She had been the supportive wife, the one who edited his reports, hosted his dull business dinners, and sacrificed her own ambitions to fuel his. She had believed it was a partnership. To him, it had been a phase. She had stumbled out of that marriage a hollowed-out shell of a woman. For months, she drifted, living off the meager settlement he deemed generous. His words echoed in the silence of her tiny new apartment, confirming her deepest fears. She was forgettable. She was nothing. Seeing him now, she remembered the visceral pain of that time. The man who had once promised to cherish her now looked straight through her, his eyes scanning her with the dispassionate air of someone viewing a piece of abstract art they didn't understand or care for. He saw an expensive dress and a billionaire's arm candy. He did not see the woman who once knew that he ground his teeth in his sleep, or that he secretly loved old black and white movies. He did not see the woman who held him when his father passed away. He had not just divorced her, he had expunged her. "There are a few people I'd like you to meet," Damien said, gently guiding her toward the museum's curators. "They're ecstatic about your work." The conversations that followed were a soothing balm on old wounds. These people didn't care who she was with. They cared about who she was. They spoke to her of technique, of pigment analysis, of the delicate art of bringing a decaying masterpiece back to life. They spoke of her talent. "Ms. Charlotte, your restoration of Aria of Dusk is simply miraculous," said Mr. Abernathy, the museum's head curator, his eyes gleaming with professional admiration. "The way you uncovered the artist's original brushstrokes beneath the centuries of grime and shoddy touch-ups, it's the work of a master. You didn't just clean a painting, you resurrected its soul." "The painting had a strong soul to begin with," Serafina replied, her voice steady and clear. "It just needed someone to listen to it." Across the room, Henry was laughing, his head thrown back as Senator Thompson clapped him on the shoulder. He was in his element, a shark in a well-stocked tank. For a moment, Serafina felt a pang, not of longing, but of a strange, detached pity. He was so busy collecting assets, he had no idea what it meant to create value. He built his empire on the skeletons of other companies, while she built her life on bringing beauty back from the brink of oblivion. As she spoke with the curators, she could feel Henry's new wife, Tiffany, watching her. It was a hostile, assessing stare. Tiffany was trying to find a flaw, a weakness, a sign that the woman on Damien Chevalier's arm was an imposter. Serafina met her gaze for a brief second, holding it without aggression, her expression serene. It was a silent, simple statement. I am not here to compete with you. I am not even in the same game. Tiffany, flustered, looked away first. Later, Damien led her to a quiet alcove overlooking the museum's sculpture garden. The noise of the gala faded to a muted hum. He didn't recognize you, Damien stated quietly. It wasn't a question. Serafina traced the rim of her champagne flute. No, he didn't. Does that bother you? She thought for a moment, truly considering it. The old me would have been devastated. She would have seen it as the ultimate proof of her worthlessness. But the old me is gone, Damien. I know it's hard to understand, but in a way, his ignorance is a gift. It means I'm finally free. He can't hurt a stranger. Damien's expression was soft, filled with a profound respect she had never once received from Henry. He's a fool, Serafina. He was a fool then, and he's a fool now. Some men are so blinded by the spotlight they can't see the sun. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently adjust a stray wisp of her hair, a gesture of such simple, tender care that it almost made her breath catch. It was a gesture of seeing her, not her dress, not her connections, but her. She knew the gala's main presentation was approaching, the unveiling, her unveiling. The fear was gone, replaced by a calm, electric anticipation. It was time for everyone, including a ghost from her past, to learn her name. The first year after the divorce was a study in gray. Serafina's world had shrunk to the four walls of her small apartment in a part of the city she'd only ever driven through, with the windows rolled up. The vibrant colors of her former life, the charity luncheons, the gallery openings, the exotic vacations, had bleached into a monotonous, washed-out existence. Henry's parting words had become her mantra of self-loathing. Forgettable. Nothing. She had tried to get a job, but her resume had a 10-year-long chasm in the middle of it labeled homemaker. Her art history degree was gathering dust. The world Henry inhabited had no place for a 35-year-old woman with no recent work experience and a quiet disposition. She was obsolete. The turning point didn't come with a flash of lightning, but with the smell of turpentine and old canvas. One rainy Tuesday, to escape the suffocating silence of her apartment, she wandered into a small, cluttered antique shop downtown. In the back corner, covered in a dusty sheet, was a painting. It was a seascape, dark and tempestuous, but underneath the layers of yellowed varnish and grime, she could see a flicker of something extraordinary. The composition, the latent power in the waves. It was good, very good. She bought it for $75, almost all the cash she had left for the week. Back in her apartment, she set to work. It started as a distraction, a way to occupy her hands and quiet her mind. She researched old restoration techniques online, buying small, inexpensive kits of solvents and pigments. With painstaking care, she began to clean a small corner of the canvas. As the first layer of grime dissolved, a sliver of brilliant cobalt blue, as pure and deep as the midnight sea, emerged. It was like watching a miracle. For the next 6 months, that painting became her entire world. The ghost of Henry's voice began to fade, replaced by the whisper of the canvas. She learned its secrets, its history. She discovered the artist's tiny, almost invisible signature hidden in the seafoam, A. Dubois, a little-known French painter from the late 18th century. She wasn't just cleaning a painting, she was communing with a soul from 200 years ago. She was bringing his vision back to the light. In restoring the lost beauty of the canvas, she began, slowly and unconsciously, to restore herself. She started eating better, wanting to be strong for the steady hand her work required. She started sleeping through the night, her mind filled with color and texture instead of regret. She had found a purpose that was entirely her own. When she was finished, the painting was transformed. The dark, muddy seascape was now a breathtaking scene of a storm-tossed ship, the moonlight breaking through the clouds to illuminate the waves with an ethereal silver light. It was magnificent. On a whim, she took a photograph and sent it to an online art forum, asking for information on Dubois. A week later, she received an email that made her heart stop. It was from a Dr. Alistair Finch, a renowned art historian at the Sorbonne in Paris. He believed her painting was part of a lost series by Dubois, thought to have been destroyed during the Revolution. He asked if he could see it in person. From there, things moved with dizzying speed. Dr. Finch flew to see her, authenticated the work, and was stunned by the quality of her restoration. "My dear girl," he'd said, his voice trembling with excitement, "this is not the work of an amateur. This is the work of an artist. You have a gift." He introduced her to the right people. Her name began to be whispered in elite art circles. A small gallery gave her another, more damaged piece to work on. She resurrected it, then another. Her reputation grew, built on a foundation of quiet, undeniable talent. She was the restorer who didn't impose her will on a piece, but listened to it, coaxing it back to its original glory. Her biggest commission came from a private collector, a name she only knew from headlines, Damien Chevalier. He owned a painting that was considered unrestorable, a high Renaissance masterpiece by a fictional master, let's call him Vasari, titled Aria of Dusk. It had been damaged in a fire decades ago, and every expert who had looked at it had declared it a lost cause. Damien summoned her not to his office, but to his private gallery, a breathtaking space that was more museum than home. He was nothing like the ruthless tech titan the media portrayed. He was quiet, intense, with eyes that saw everything. He didn't talk to her about money or contracts. He talked to her about the painting. "They say the soul is gone," he said, standing before the blackened, cracked canvas. "They say all that's left is a husk." Serafina studied the piece for a long time, her gaze tracing the faint lines visible beneath the damage. "No," she said softly, "the soul isn't gone. It's just sleeping, under a blanket of smoke." Damien had hired her on the spot. For the next 2 years, she worked in a state-of-the-art studio he had built for her. It was the most challenging project of her life, a delicate dance between science and art. There were setbacks, moments she feared the painting was truly lost, but she never gave up. Damien was a constant source of support, not as a boss, but as a believer. He would visit the studio, bringing her tea, and they would sit in silence for hours, just watching the painting slowly re-emerge from the darkness. He learned her story, piece by piece, not because he pried, but because in the quiet safety of the studio she felt, for the first time since the divorce, able to speak it. He never pitied her. He only ever expressed a quiet fury at the man who had been given a treasure and had been too blind to see it. The day she finished, they unveiled it together in the studio. The Aria of Dusk was alive again. A portrait of a woman bathed in twilight, her expression holding a universe of sorrow and hope. In her eyes, Serafina had painted her own story. "It's your masterpiece, Serafina," Damien had said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just the paintings, yours." He had arranged for the painting to be the centerpiece of the museum's new Chevalier wing, and he had insisted on one condition, that the world know the name of the artist who saved it. Her physical transformation had happened organically during this time. With her newfound success came confidence. She started dressing for herself, discovering her own style. She worked with a trainer not to be thin, but to be strong. The haunted, hollowed-out woman from the divorce had been painted over, layer by layer, with the vibrant colors of self-worth and purpose, until a new image emerged. The woman in the emerald green dress, the woman Henry Thomas looked at and saw only a stranger. The gala was in full swing, a symphony of clinking glasses and calculated laughter. Henry Thomas, having successfully cornered and charmed Senator Thompson, was now on the prowl for his ultimate prize, an introduction to Damien Chevalier. Henry's firm was trying to secure the cybersecurity contract for Chevalier's massive empire, a deal that would make his year and solidify his status as a kingmaker. Chevalier was notoriously inaccessible, and this gala was a rare opportunity. he spotted Chevalier standing near the grand staircase, still accompanied by the enigmatic woman in green. They were in a quiet conversation with the museum director. This was his moment. "Wish me luck," he murmured to Tiffany, straightening his bow tie. "I'm going in." Tiffany patted his arm. "Don't forget to introduce me. I want a closer look at her dress. I'm sure it's a rental." Henry strode forward, deploying the easy, confident smile that had disarmed boardrooms and rivals alike. "Mr. Chevalier, a pleasure. Henry Thomas of Thomas Whitlock. I've been a great admirer of your work for years." Damien turned slowly, his gaze cool and analytical. He gave Henry a nod that was barely perceptible. "Thomas," the single word was delivered with an utter lack of warmth. Henry, undeterred, pressed on. He was used to warming up a cold room. "I was just speaking with Senator Thompson about the new digital infrastructure bill. It has some fascinating implications for the private sector, particularly for a company with your reach." He was so focused on Damien, so intent on landing his pitch, that he offered only the most cursory of glances to Serafina. He gave her a slight, dismissive nod, the kind of acknowledgement one gives to a secretary or an assistant, before turning his full attention back to the billionaire. Serafina's composure was flawless. Her expression remained serene, a mask of polite interest, but inside her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. To be this close, to be looked at with such complete and utter non-recognition, it was a surreal, out-of-body experience. "Mr. Thomas," Damien said, his voice cutting through Henry's spiel, "my interests tonight are in art, not legislation. In fact, my companion and I were just discussing the fascinating use of lapis lazuli in Renaissance portraiture. What are your thoughts on the matter, my dear?" He had turned pointedly to Serafina, drawing her into the center of the conversation and simultaneously erecting a wall against Henry. The move was subtle but brilliant. Henry faltered, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. He'd been dismissed, and by proxy for a woman he considered irrelevant. "I'm afraid I'd have to defer to the expert," he said, his tone laced with a condescending sweetness as he looked at Serafina. "I'm more of a numbers man myself." "Indeed," Serafina replied, her voice calm and even. The sound of it, clear and melodic, seemed to snag on something in the air. Henry's head tilted slightly. That voice. Where had he heard that voice? It was like a half-forgotten song from a distant dream. It held a musicality that was both soothing and, for some reason he couldn't place, deeply unsettling. He looked at her again, really looked this time, trying to place her. The elegant sweep of her hair, the intelligent light in her dark eyes. There was something there, a ghost of a memory he couldn't quite grasp. He was distracted by Tiffany, who had sashayed over, unable to be left out of the orbit of power. "Henry, darling, is this the famous Mr. Chevalier?" She extended a hand to Damien, who took it briefly, his expression unreadable. "And you must be his—" Tiffany began, her eyes sweeping over Serafina with blatant disdain. "Guest." "This is Ms. Serafina Charlotte," Damien said, his tone leaving no room for misinterpretation. "She is my esteemed colleague and a personal friend." The name meant nothing to Henry. Charlotte. It wasn't a name he knew, not anymore. He'd forgotten that it was her maiden name, the one she had proudly reclaimed the day their divorce was finalized. "Charmed," Tiffany said, the word dripping with insincerity. An uncomfortable silence descended. Henry, frustrated at having lost control of the conversation, decided to try a different tack, one designed to put the pretty but silent woman in her place. "So, Miss Charlotte," he began, adopting a patronizing tone, "are you an artist? A painter, perhaps? Mr. Chevalier is known for his patronage." The insinuation was clear. She was a kept woman, a talented pet. Before Serafina could answer, the museum director, Mr. Abernathy, who had been hovering nearby, stepped forward. "An artist?" he chuckled, as if Henry had told a delightful joke. "Mr. Thomas, you are far too modest in your description. Miss Charlotte is a magician. She is the genius we have to thank for the masterpiece you are all about to see." Henry stared, his brow furrowed in confusion. A magician? A masterpiece? What was the old man talking about? He felt a prickle of unease, the distinct feeling that he had stumbled into a play where everyone but him knew the lines. The woman, Serafina Charlotte, simply watched him, her expression calm, her eyes holding a depth he couldn't begin to fathom. The feeling that he was missing something crucial, something right in front of his face, was becoming overwhelming. The lights in the grand ballroom began to dim, a signal for the evening's main presentation to begin. A wave of polite applause rippled through the crowd as the museum's director, Mr. Abernathy, took his place at a podium on the stage. A massive screen behind him flickered to life. Henry found his usual table near the front, Tiffany fussing with her wrap beside him. His mind, however, was not on the stage. It was snagged on the strange encounter with Chevalier and the woman, Serafina Charlotte. Her voice, her name, the way the curator had spoken of her, it was a puzzle his arrogant mind couldn't quite solve. He kept glancing over his shoulder toward Damien Chevalier's table, where the woman sat with a poise that was beginning to infuriate him. Who was she? Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed patrons of the arts, Mr. Abernathy began, his voice resonating with genuine passion. Tonight marks a historic moment for this institution. As you know, for the past 2 years, we have been constructing the new Chevalier Wing, a gallery dedicated to the preservation of Renaissance masterpieces. This was made possible by the unparalleled generosity of one man, Mr. Damien Chevalier. He gestured toward Damien, who gave a brief, humble nod as a spotlight found him. The room erupted in thunderous applause. Henry clapped along, a bitter taste in his mouth. But while Mr. Chevalier provided the magnificent vessel, Abernathy continued, his voice dropping for dramatic effect. The true jewel of the collection, its very heart, was a piece long thought lost to the world, a painting so damaged by time and tragedy that the world's foremost experts declared it unsalvageable. I am speaking, of course, of Vasari's magnum opus, Aria of Dusk. A collective gasp went through the audience. The Aria of Dusk was legendary, a painting known only through sketches and historical descriptions. Its loss in a fire nearly a century ago was considered one of the art world's greatest tragedies. On the screen behind Abernathy, an image appeared, a blackened, cracked, and barely recognizable canvas. It was the painting Serafina had first shown Damien. For 2 years, Abernathy said, a single brilliant individual has labored in secret, dedicating their heart and soul to a task deemed impossible. They did not simply clean a canvas. They performed a resurrection. They listened to the whispers of a 500-year-old masterpiece and coaxed its voice back into a song. Henry leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. This was the masterpiece the old man had been talking about. Tonight, for the first time, we present to you the restored Aria of Dusk. The blackened image on the screen dissolved, replaced by a high-resolution photograph of the finished painting. It was breathtaking. A woman's face, luminous and haunting, seemed to emerge from a swirling background of twilight colors. Her eyes held a story of profound sadness and resilient hope. The artistry was so sublime it seemed to vibrate with life. The room was filled with audible gasps of awe and disbelief. And the visionary who achieved this miracle, Abernathy declared, his voice ringing with triumph, is with us tonight. She is a woman whose talent is matched only by her grace and dedication. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in honoring the world's preeminent art restorer, Ms. Serafina Charlotte. A brilliant, white spotlight shot across the darkened ballroom, landing directly on Damien Chevalier's table. It illuminated the woman in the emerald green dress, Serafina Charlotte. The name echoed in the cavern of Henry's skull. Charlotte, it was her maiden name. The name of the mousy, quiet girl he had married out of college. The name she had taken back with a quiet defiance he hadn't bothered to acknowledge. Serafina Charlotte. It couldn't be. His brain began to short-circuit. The image on the screen, the face in the painting, the woman in the spotlight. It all swirled together in a nauseating vortex. Her voice, her smile, the strange flicker of familiarity. It all crashed down on him with the force of a tidal wave. The woman standing to acknowledge the room's thunderous, roaring ovation was not a stranger. She was his ex-wife. She was Sarah, the woman he had called boring, the woman he had told was forgettable, the woman he had cast aside because she wasn't a valuable asset. He stared, his mouth agape, his champagne glass frozen halfway to his lips. The blood drained from his face, leaving him with a clammy, ghostly pallor. Tiffany was saying something to him, shaking his arm, but he couldn't hear her. The only sound was the roaring in his ears and the name that was now being chanted by the most powerful people in the city. Serafina, Serafina, Serafina. She stood in the spotlight, a radiant smile on her face, accepting the adoration of the world. And as her eyes swept the room, they met his for a fraction of a second. There was no triumph in them, no malice. There was only a calm, quiet finality. It was the look one gives to a stranger you pass on the street, a look of complete and utter indifference. In that single devastating moment, Henry Thomas, the king of his own universe, understood. He had not only forgotten her, he had fundamentally, catastrophically misjudged everything. And his entire carefully constructed world had just shattered into a million pieces. The standing ovation was a physical assault. Each clap of a hand was a hammer blow against the fragile shell of Henry's composure. The sound swelled, a deafening roar that seemed to suck the very air from his lungs, pressing in on him from all sides. He sat paralyzed as the entire world, his world, rose to its feet to celebrate the woman he had deemed a footnote. The brilliant spotlight that held her in its incandescent embrace felt like a surgical instrument, pinning her there for his inspection, forcing him to see what he had been blind to for a decade. His mind, a finely tuned machine of logic and aggression, fractured into a kaleidoscope of disjointed images. He saw her, the woman on the stage, radiant and poised in emerald silk, and in the same instant, he saw a ghost in a worn-out cardigan, her face smudged with flour, telling him she'd tried a new recipe for his dinner. He saw her smile graciously at Damien Chevalier, and then he saw her crying silently in their bedroom after one of his cutting remarks about her lack of ambition. The dissonance was a nauseating vertigo, a complete system failure of his reality. This woman, celebrated as a genius, and the wife he had discarded as dead weight, could not be the same person. And yet, they were. "Henry, sit down! Everyone is staring!" Tiffany hissed, her fingers digging into his arm like talons. Her panic was not for him, but for their shared reflection in the unforgiving mirror of public opinion. But he couldn't stay seated. A primal, irrational force took hold of him. It was the same instinct that drove him in the boardroom, the absolute refusal to lose control of the narrative. He could not sit by and let this new, impossible reality solidify without confronting it, without trying to wrestle it back into a shape that made sense. He had to understand. He had to know. He pushed his chair back with a jarring screech, the sound lost in the final crescendo of applause. "Don't you dare," Tiffany warned, her eyes wide with frantic alarm. "Don't you go over there. You will make this 1,000 times worse." He didn't hear her. He was already moving, a man possessed, drawn toward the source of his world's cataclysm. The walk across the ballroom was the longest of his life. The sea of tuxedos and ball gowns parted for him, creating a wide, silent corridor. Conversations ceased as he passed. Faces turned, no longer hiding their curiosity, their expressions a mixture of morbid fascination and contempt. He was a spectacle, a train wreck in slow motion. As he neared the table, he saw Damien Chevalier's head lift. The billionaire's eyes, which had been filled with warmth for Serafina, hardened into chips of ice as they landed on Henry. It was not a look of anger. It was a look of utter disgust, the kind a man gives to something verminous he finds in his home. Henry ignored it all. His entire focus was on the woman who had just taken her seat, her back straight, her composure a fortress of calm. He stopped at the edge of the table, a specter at the celebration, feeling clumsy and brutish in her newfound atmosphere of grace. "Sarah!" The name was a ragged whisper, torn from his throat. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, the faintest acknowledgement of the old pet name, before the placid mask of polite indifference returned. It's really you." Serafina, in a gesture of magnificent control, picked up her water goblet. She took a slow, deliberate sip, the silence stretching into an eternity, before placing it back on the coaster with a soft click. Only then did she meet his gaze. "Hello, Henry." The sheer normalcy of the greeting, The absence of rage or tears or any of the messy emotions he expected was more disorienting than any outburst would have been. His mind scrambled for purchase. I, I don't understand, he stammered, gesturing helplessly at the room, at Damien, at her. This, all of this. What is this? What game are you playing? How do you know him? The questions tumbled out, accusatory and self-centered. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was demanding an explanation for a universe that had suddenly stopped revolving around him. A shadow of fury crossed Damien's face. He started to lean forward, his mouth opening to unleash what would have undoubtedly been a scathing termination of the conversation. But Serafina, without even looking at him, laid a delicate hand on his arm. The gesture was both a restraint and a reassurance. A silent message passed between them. Let me. This is mine. Damien subsided, but the tension in his jaw, the protective fury simmering in his eyes remained. Serafina turned her full attention back to Henry, her expression one of clinical curiosity, like a scientist examining a strange, predictable specimen. A game? She repeated softly, the words carrying a clear, cutting precision. You think my life's work, my passion, the very thing that rebuilt my soul, is a game aimed at you? That you still believe yourself to be the center of my universe is telling. It confirms you've learned absolutely nothing. But this is impossible, he sputtered, desperate for a foothold. You were a homemaker. You cataloged books. This, he gestured at the image of the masterpiece on the now idling screen. This is the work of a genius. For the first time, a genuine emotion surfaced in her eyes. A deep, profound pity. The genius was always there, Henry. You just didn't care to look. You wanted a manager for your home, not a partner for your life. You wanted someone to be the quiet background for your loud success. And I, fool that I was, played the part for a very long time. She leaned forward, her voice dropping lower, pulling him into an unwilling intimacy. Do you remember our last conversation, Henry? The day you handed me the divorce papers as if you were returning a library book? I do. I remember every single word. You told me I was pleasant, but uninspired. You told me I had no ambition. And then you said the words that became the bars of my prison for a full year. He flinched as she paused, forcing him to live in the agonizing space of his own memory. You told me, you're forgettable, Sarah. In a year, no one will even remember your name. She delivered his own words back to him not with venom, but with a strange, detached finality, as if she were reading a historical fact from a textbook. He visibly recoiled, the cruelty of his long-forgotten pronouncement striking him with the force of a physical blow. It seems you were right, she continued, her voice as smooth and cool as the silk of her dress. You forgot me. You forgot me so completely, so utterly, that you didn't even recognize your own wife when she was standing 3 feet away from you, an hour ago. You looked right through me. So I suppose I should thank you. Your prediction came true. She held his shattered gaze for one last, devastating second. But here is the beautiful irony that a man like you could never appreciate. While you were so busy forgetting me, I was busy becoming someone unforgettable. It was a checkmate delivered in a whisper. With that, the conversation was over. The trial was concluded. The sentence passed. Serafina gracefully, definitively, turned her body away from him. She picked up her fork, her attention shifting to Damien, and asked him a quiet question about the dessert menu. The dismissal was absolute. It was more profound than a slap or a scream. He had ceased to exist for her. Henry stood there frozen, his blood roaring in his ears. He was invisible, a ghost at his own execution. Then he heard it, a whisper from a nearby table, a woman's voice dripping with malice and glee. My God, that's his ex-wife. Can you imagine being that much of a fool? The spell was broken. Humiliation, hot and total, flooded every cell in his body. He turned, a broken king in a kingdom that had just witnessed his public dethroning, and began the long, shameful retreat. The Gala, once Henry Thomas's triumphant arena, had transformed into a coliseum where he was the main event, thrown to the lions of society's judgment. His long, agonizing walk back to his table was a gauntlet of stairs. He saw it all in the brief, flickering glances of the city's elite, the shock, the barely concealed pity, and, most damningly, the glint of amusement in the eyes of his rivals. He had built his reputation on being the smartest man in any room, the predator who saw every angle. Tonight, he had been revealed as the blindest. He was a joke. He collapsed into his chair, the plush velvet feeling like a bed of thorns. Tiffany, her face a mask of cold fury, didn't look at him. She was staring straight ahead, her jaw clenched so tightly a muscle pulsed in her cheek. The air between them was thick with the frost of her silent rage. "Did you know?" she finally hissed, her voice a venomous whisper that cut through the surrounding din. "Did you have any idea what she had become?" "Of course not," Henry managed, his own voice sounding hollow and distant. Tiffany let out a short, brutal laugh devoid of all humor. "That's what's so pathetic, Henry. Of course you didn't. You, the great visionary. You were married to the most celebrated artist of the night, the personal friend of Damien Chevalier, and you let her go. You didn't just let her go, you threw her out like last season's fashion. Do you have any idea how this makes me look?" Her focus wasn't on his pain or his loss, but on the damage to her own carefully curated brand. "I'm the woman who came after," she seethed. "The upgrade, as you so charmingly put it. Now I'm just the fool who attached herself to the man who couldn't recognize a masterpiece hanging in his own home. You haven't just humiliated yourself, you've made me a laughingstock." He had no response. Every word was a perfectly aimed dart, and he had no shield left. He watched as Serafina and Damien prepared to leave. A small crowd had gathered around them, a constellation of curators, collectors, and society's true tastemakers, all orbiting Serafina's quiet radiance. She moved through them with an effortless grace he'd never seen in her, accepting their praise with a humble smile. As Damien placed a protective hand on the small of her back to guide her out, they shared a look, a silent, intimate communication of two people perfectly in sync. It was a look of profound partnership, the very thing Henry had claimed to be building his entire life, yet had never truly understood. They didn't look back. They didn't need to. His chapter in her life was so definitively closed that it wasn't even worth a final glance. The aftermath was not a slow decline. It was a catastrophic collapse. The following morning, his phone rang. It was Robert Michelson, a notoriously shrewd investor who controlled a $20 billion fund and had been on the verge of entrusting a significant portion of it to Henry's firm. "Thomas," Michelson's voice boomed, devoid of its usual false bonhomie. "I was at the Met last night." It wasn't a question. "Robert, I can explain." "Don't," Michelson cut him off. "There's nothing to explain. I invest in judgment, in foresight. I give my money to men who can see what others can't, who can identify value before it's obvious. Last night, the entire city learned that your ex-wife, a woman you lived with for a decade, evolved into a cultural icon, and you didn't even recognize her face. It's not just a personal embarrassment, Henry. It's a data point. It tells me your perceptions are flawed. If you can have a blind spot that massive in your personal life, God knows what you're missing in my portfolio. We're pulling out. The deal is dead." The line clicked, and a pillar of Henry's empire crumbled to dust. The news hit the Wall Street journals by noon. The story was irresistible. The corporate raider with a fatal lack of vision. His partners at Thomas Whitlock requested an emergency meeting where they spoke to him in hushed, funereal tones about managing the optics and reassuring the clients. He could see it in their eyes. The deference was gone, replaced by a nervous calculation. He was no longer their leader. He was a problem to be solved, a liability to be contained. Tiffany was gone by evening. She didn't even do him the courtesy of a final argument. He came home to find her closets bare, a single perfect diamond bracelet left on his nightstand, the first one he had ever given her. Beside it lay a note from her lawyer informing him that their prenuptial agreement was ironclad and that any communication should go through her legal team. She had severed their connection with the same cold, transactional efficiency he had once admired. He was finally truly alone, a king in an empty castle. His penthouse, once a symbol of his arrival, now felt like a mausoleum. The sprawling white spaces and floor-to-ceiling windows only amplified his isolation. For days he drifted through the silent rooms, haunted by the ghost he had only just recognized. One evening, searching for a bottle of scotch, he opened a storage closet and found a dusty box left behind from his move. Inside, beneath old tax documents, was a book, a collection of poetry by Rilke. He opened it, and on the inside cover, in her elegant, looping script, was an inscription. For my Henry. So you never forget the beauty in the quiet things. Love, Sarah. He sank to the floor, the book clutched in his hand, and a wave of memory, sharp and agonizing, washed over him. He remembered her reading it to him late at night. He remembered scoffing at her passion for dusty old things. He remembered telling her that ambition, not art, was what shaped the world. He had systematically dismantled her passions, starved her soul of everything that lit her up, and then had the audacity to call her dull. His regret was a physical ache, a crushing weight in his chest. It wasn't just about the money or the status he now stood to lose. It was the dawning, horrifying realization of the true nature of his loss. He hadn't just lost a wife. He had discarded a genuine, unconditional love. He had traded a life of quiet beauty for one of loud, hollow victory. He had surrounded himself with assets and transactions, and in the end, that's all he had. When his value plummeted, he was left with nothing and no one. Meanwhile, Serafina's world was expanding into a vibrant, limitless horizon. The story of the Gala, from her perspective, was one of quiet vindication, not loud revenge. She became a symbol of reinvention. She and Damien traveled not on the whirlwind, see-and-be-seen tour of the ultra-rich, but on a quiet pilgrimage to the world's greatest art. They stood before a Caravaggio in Rome, and he was captivated not by its price tag, but by her whispered explanation of the artist's use of chiaroscuro to convey despair. They wandered the gardens of Kyoto, and he learned from her the beauty in imperfection, the philosophy of wabi-sabi. Theirs was a love affair of the mind and the soul, a stark contrast to the contractual obligations Henry had called relationships. Months later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, Serafina stood in her own sun-drenched studio overlooking the Hudson River. The light was golden, illuminating the fine particles of dust and pigment that danced in the air like earthbound stars. The scent of linseed oil and turpentine was her perfume. She was working not on a restoration, but on her own creation. On the easel before her was a large canvas, a landscape taking shape. It was a forest scene, a dense thicket of dark, gnarled trees in the foreground. But in the distance, through the shadows, was a clearing, bathed in the brilliant, hopeful light of a new dawn. Her past was the darkness in that painting, necessary, foundational, providing the contrast that made the light so brilliant. Henry was a part of that shadow, a figure she no longer hated or feared, but understood as a catalyst for the pressure that had transformed her. His blindness had forced her to learn to see herself. She picked up a fine-tipped brush, dipped it in a vibrant, sun-yellow pigment, and with a steady hand added another ray of light breaking through the trees. She was at peace, her heart filled not with the satisfaction of an enemy vanquished, but with the profound, quiet joy of a masterpiece in the making. Her own. What an incredible journey of transformation. Serafina's story is a powerful reminder that our worth is not defined by how others see us, but by how we see ourselves. Henry Thomas looked at a masterpiece and only saw a blank canvas, a mistake that cost him everything. Serafina, on the other hand, rebuilt her life with the same care and brilliance she used to restore a priceless work of art. She proved that the most beautiful transformations often happen when we are brave enough to erase the parts of our lives that tell us we are anything less than magnificent. What did you think of Henry's stunning moment of realization? Was his downfall satisfying? Let me know in the comments below. If you were moved by Serafina's story of quiet triumph, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of justice, empowerment, and unforgettable comebacks.